Welcome to the Deep Dive. Get ready to plunge into the mind of one of the late Roman Republic's most fascinating figures, Marcus Tullius Cicero.
Ah, Cicero. He's such a pivotal character.
He really is.
Ah.
He's the bridge, really, between those ancient Greek philosophical giants and the incredibly tumultuous world of Roman politics. And his ideas, they echoed for centuries.
That's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Cicero wasn't just living through the end of an era, the Roman Republic's final gasp.
Right.
He was actively trying to understand that world and maybe even save it using the wisdom of the past. He was, without doubt, Rome's preeminent political thinker.
And our sources for this really highlight his critical role, not just as a politician,
Right.
but as someone transmitting Greek thought, especially Stoicism, into the Roman sphere.
Exactly. And from there, ultimately, into the very DNA of Western political tradition. It's quite a legacy.
And our guide for this deep dive is a superb stack of material, primarily excerpts from a work on Western political thought. It gives us a really sharp focus on Cicero, his ideas, and the incredibly complex world he was trying to navigate.
Yeah, the context is just crucial for understanding him.
So our mission here, really, is to pull out the most important nuggets from these sources. What were Cicero's key ideas? What shaped his thinking?
And why did his big political project ultimately fail? That's a key question.
It is. And why, despite that failure, is he still so incredibly important for our understanding of political thought today?
Right. Why are we still talking about him?
Absolutely. Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding Cicero's place in the grand sweep of political philosophy. We're going to start by setting the scene, understanding the dramatic shift happening in the political world he inherited. Big changes.
Huge changes, from city-state to empire.
Then we'll explore the new philosophical currents that popped up in that era, focusing particularly on Stoicism and its, groundbreaking concept of natural law.
Which Cicero picks up and runs with.
Definitely.
Yeah.
After that, we'll zoom in on Cicero himself, his life, his political struggle, the drama, and then we'll unpack the core ideas from his major works like De Republica and the Legibus.
Getting into the nitty-gritty of his theories.
Exactly. Finally, we'll look at the practical challenges he faced, trying to apply these, let's face it, pretty high-minded ideas to the messy reality of Rome.
Yeah, the collision between theory and practice.
And we'll wrestle with why his political efforts fell short, ultimately, but his philosophical legacy just endures and endures.
Sounds like quite a journey. Let's jump in.
Okay, So let's set the stage first. We spent time in other deep dives talking about guys like Plato and Aristotle, right?
Right.
And how their political thought was really, really focused on the Greek polis, the city-state.
That was their whole world, politically speaking.
But as our sources make crystal clear, that world, the polis, it was already disappearing even in Aristotle's own lifetime. It was fading fast.
That's such a critical starting point. I mean, Aristotle's masterpiece, The Politics, it's this brilliant dissection of the small, self-sufficient Greek city-state.
Yeah.
For him, the polis was the natural environment for human flourishing, the only place where virtue could be fully realized through active citizenship. It was everything.
But history, as they say, had other plans.
It certainly did. The sources point out that while Aristotle was theorizing about the ideal polis, a completely new kind of political entity was emerging.
The vast empire. First under Alexander the Great, and then, of course, Rome itself.
Exactly. And you have to understand, this wasn't just like Greece getting bigger. These weren't just scaled-up city-states.
No, the scale was completely different.
The Macedonian and later the Roman empires were on a totally different level. They covered immense territories, incorporated incredibly diverse populations, different languages, customs, histories, gods, you name it.
Governing these places wasn't about citizens debating in the agora anymore.
Not even close. It was about distant emperors, often generals who seized power, ruling over these seemingly limitless expanses. The whole political and social reality just shifted fundamentally. It was a paradigm shift.
And with that massive shift in scale came new forms of rule, didn't they? Often moving away from that ideal of citizen participation towards something more centralized, more, monarchical.
Precisely. Monarchy became the dominant form of government in this Hellenistic period. But, and our source is careful to note this wasn't necessarily the ideal philosophical monarchy that Plato or Aristotle might have talked about in theory.
No. What was different?
Well, these were often rulers who took on characteristics more akin to what the Greeks might have called Oriental potentates.
Oriental potentates. What does that mean in this context?
It means they asserted a much more absolute form of power. They often claimed divine right, or at least some kind of semi-divine status. The source mentions Alexander himself was deified, a practice that significantly continued and became crucial for Roman emperors later on.
Ah, so the emperor as a god, or close to it.
Right. And these ideas of absolute divinely sanctioned power, the source explains, actually had roots in the East. Alexander's conquests sort of broke down the barriers and facilitated this fusion of Greek and Oriental political concepts and practices.
So those traditional Greek ideas about the state, about justice, about citizenship, all rooted in that small, intimate communal setting of the policy, they just didn't really fit this new reality of vast empires and godlike emperors.
They lost their immediate relevance, yeah. The intimacy, the direct engagement, the shared sense of community that underpinned Aristotelian citizenship and virtue. How could that possibly work in a sprawling empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia?
So a pretty long stretch of time.
Nearly 3 centuries, and it's distinct from the earlier Hellenic period, which was the age of the independent Greek city-states, Athens, Sparta, Thebes.
Right.
The Hellenistic age is the age of empire, the age of cultural mixing Hellenism spreading across Alexander's conquests and interacting with local cultures. And crucially for us, it was an age where thinkers had to develop new philosophies to make sense of a world where the traditional political community, the polis, was no longer the central focus of life for most people.
Which leads us neatly into our next section, the philosophical responses that emerged in this Hellenistic world, and how they shifted their focus quite dramatically, it seems, towards the individual.
Yeah, that's the big shift.
So what were the big players among these new schools of thought?
Our sources highlight 3 as particularly significant for understanding the philosophical landscape: Cynicism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism. Of course, you still had the older schools around Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Peripatetics, they persisted. And there were other currents, like skepticism and eclecticism, which Cicero himself drew on. But these 3 new ones, they really captured the spirit of the age.
And what was that spirit? What did these new schools have in common that reflected the challenges of living in one of these huge impersonal empires?
Well, the source uses a great phrase here. It says they reflected the vastness, psychic rootlessness, and ethical dislocations characteristic of empire.
Psychic rootlessness, that really resonates. Explain that a bit more.
Think about it. If your sense of identity, your sense of belonging, your whole ethical framework was traditionally tied to your specific city-state, your polis.
Right, being an Athenian or a Spartan.
Exactly. And now that city-state is just a relatively minor part of a massive impersonal empire ruled from far away, maybe by people who don't even speak your language. While you might feel a sense of disorientation, a lack of roots, who am I, where do I belong, what are the rules now?
Okay, yeah. So if the traditional community, the polis, was no longer the main source of meaning and identity, where did people look?
Precisely. The focus shifted inward. Since the community, as Aristotle understood it, it was essentially, as the source puts it, moribund, the philosophical spotlight moved dramatically onto the individual.
Ah, so it became about finding meaning within yourself.
That's the core idea. Fulfillment, happiness, eudaimonia, these had to be found within the individual soul, largely independent of external political conditions or social status.
Which sounds like a definite turn towards subjectivity, valuing the inner life above all else.
It absolutely is. These new thinkers stress the importance of the inner life, your thoughts, your judgments, your character, over external factors that had previously defined success, like political power, social status, wealth. They echoed Socrates, in a way, with their belief that virtue, moral excellence alone could produce inner peace and serenity, making all those external things secondary or even irrelevant.
And they also shared a concept that feels surprisingly modern, cosmopolitanism.
Yes. This was a direct consequence of the imperial reality. If your identity isn't confined to your little city-state anymore, you start to see yourself as part of something much larger.
The world.
The world, exactly. Or even the cosmos. The Cynics and Stoics, in particular, developed this idea of the individual as a citizen of the cosmopolis, the world city.
Our source calls this a real advance in Western political consciousness. That sounds pretty significant.
It truly was a huge leap. It broke down the parochialism, the intense us versus them mentality that often characterized earlier Greek thought, Greek versus barbarian.
Right.
It challenged deeply held beliefs like the idea of natural slavery or the inherent inferiority of non-Greeks. It asserted, quite radically for the time, a fundamental equality of all human beings, simply by virtue of their shared humanity or rationality. regardless of their origin, social standing, whether they were Greek or Roman, slave or noble.
That's a crucial step towards our modern concept of universal human equality, isn't it?
It absolutely is a foundational moment.
But, somewhat paradoxically perhaps, given this idea of world citizenship, these schools were generally apolitical, even anti-political, in their orientation.
That was another common thread, yes. Though, as we'll see, Stoicism is a significant partial exception here, which becomes very important for Cicero.
Okay.
But generally, they tended to view the politics of the empire, the power struggles, the corruption, the sheer scale and impersonality as inherently messy, corrupting, and ultimately detrimental to the inner peace and virtue they sought.
So getting involved in politics was seen as, what, a distraction? Or worse?
Often worse, a source of anxiety, frustration, and moral compromise. So withdrawal from civic life was often seen as a necessary precondition for achieving their philosophical goals, for cultivating that inner tranquility.
Okay, let's quickly touch on cynicism then. They seem to have taken this individualism and withdrawal to its most extreme, maybe even outrageous conclusion.
They absolutely did. You have figures like Antisthenes and Diogenes who were actually followers of Socrates in different ways. The Cynics were radical individualists.
Awesome.
They rejected traditional social norms, conventions, laws, civic life, pretty much everything, with this almost defiant zeal. Their version of virtue was extreme inner peace, self-sufficiency, and a complete acceptance of whatever fate or taish threw at them.
And they famously demonstrated this through, well, unconventional behavior.
Unconventional is putting it mildly, often shocking public behavior. Diogenes living in a tub or a large jar, publicly challenging authority figures like Alexander the Great, deliberately flouting social etiquette, basically living like a dog.
Ah, which is where the name cynic comes from. Kynikos, dog-like.
Precisely. So their impact was less about writing dense philosophical treatises and more about living their philosophy out loud, often as a form of sharp social critique or mockery.
Kind of performance art philosophy.
In a way, yes. The source notes their influence was more through their actions and their mockery of convention than through deep philosophical systems. They did influence early Stoicism, but as a distinct school, they were eventually kind of overshadowed by Stoicism, which offered a more sustainable and frankly workable philosophy for life.
Did they have that cosmopolitan outlook too?
Oh, yes, very much so. They saw themselves as natural citizens of the world and viewed distinctions like master and slave, Greek and barbarian, as purely conventional, artificial, and ultimately meaningless.
Okay. And then there's Epicureanism. It shared some characteristics with cynicism, like the individualism and withdrawal, but had a very different core ethical principle, right?
Right. Epicureanism also emphasized individualism, the focus on the subjective inner life, cosmopolitanism, and a strong aversion to political engagement. So similar starting points in reflecting the age.
But their ethics were different.
Very different. Their ethical core was hedonism, the belief that the good is the pleasurable. They argued, quite reasonably perhaps, that humans are naturally driven to maximize pleasure and minimize pain.
Now, when we hear hedonism today, we often think of wild indulgence. But our source clarifies this wasn't Epicurus' idea at all.
No, absolutely not. That's a common misconception, often pushed by their critics. Epicurus and his followers championed balance, moderation, prudence. They sought gentle, lasting pleasures, things like friendship, affection, philosophical discussion, intellectual pursuits. Simple things.
Not wild parties and luxury.
Definitely not. Those things often lead to more pain and anxiety in the long run, they argued. The ultimate goal was ataraxia, tranquility, serenity, the absence of pain, fear, and disturbance in the soul.
Which explains why they avoided politics like the plague.
It was a direct consequence of their ethics. They saw political life, especially in the tumultuous world of Hellenistic kingdoms and the collapsing Roman Republic, as inherently immoderate, full of anxiety, conflict, ambition, fear, potential pain, just the opposite of ataraxia.
So stay out of it to stay peaceful.
Exactly. As Epicurus is famously quoted in the source, we must release ourselves from the prison of affairs and politics. Politics is a prison keeping you from true happiness.
And their political theory, consequently, seems quite minimal, almost like they developed it begrudgingly because they had to say something.
It was very thin, yes. Like the sophists and cynics before them, they viewed the state and political community not as natural entities rooted in human nature, but as purely conventional arrangements. A contract.
The contract for what?
Basically for mutual protection. The source quotes Epicurus defining justice as a kind of compact not to harm or be harmed. It's an agreement people make out of self-interest to avoid chaos and mutual destruction.
And critically, people obey laws. Why?
Yeah.
Out of a sense of duty or justice?
Nope. purely out of fear of punishment. Not because the law is inherently just or reflects some natural order, but because getting caught breaking it leads to pain. It's a fundamentally utilitarian, fear-based view of law and the state.
Very skeptical.
Hmm?
Reminds me of Glaucon's argument in Plato's Republic that justice is only practiced unwillingly out of fear of consequences.
Exactly the same line of thought. Justice isn't good in itself, it's just a necessary evil we agree to, because the alternative, anarchy, is worse.
So summing up these two schools, while cynicism and Epicureanism definitely reflected the challenges of empire by turning inward and advocating withdrawal, they didn't really provide a robust political philosophy, did they? Not one for how to actually govern or live meaningfully within these new large political entities?
Precisely. Their cosmopolitanism might have broadened perspectives on human equality, which was important, but their view of practical politics was overwhelmingly negative, and their theories of the state were too thin, too based on pure convention and fear, to form the basis for a meaningful political philosophy for the age of empire.
They told you how to cope, maybe, but not how to build or sustain a just society on a large scale.
Exactly. And that's where Stoicism really distinguishes itself. It found a way back, in a sense.
Ah, the path to natural law, our next section. How did Stoicism manage to bridge that gap? How did it create a relevant political theory for empire when the others basically said, check out?
Well, Stoicism, founded by Zeno, who initially studied with cynics, actually shared some initial attitudes with cynicism, like that emphasis on individual virtue, self-sufficiency, and inner peace. But it developed a core concept that profoundly reconnected the individual to something larger than themselves.
Okay, what was that?
The concept of universal reason and nature. This is the key.
Tell me more about that. What did they mean by reason permeating the universe? Sounds pretty grand.
It is grand. The central Stoic idea, as the source explains it, is that there is a fundamental universal reason. They called it the divine logos, or word, or rational principle, that orders and permeates the entire cosmos. Everything that happens is part of this rational plan.
Okay, like a cosmic intelligence.
Sort of, yes. And here's the crucial part for humans. We as human beings are rational creatures precisely because we partake in this same universal rationality. We have a spark of that divine fire, that logos within us.
So our ability to reason isn't just a human quirk. It's our connection to the fundamental order of the universe.
Exactly. And this connection is absolutely crucial for their social and political thought. If we're all participating in the same universal rational nature, then we aren't just isolated individuals floating randomly through the cosmos, like the Epicureans might suggest.
We're connected.
We are fundamentally connected. The source says we are connected to each other as part of a larger rational order. And here's the critical leap for politics. This shared rationality means we are social and political creatures by nature.
Back to Aristotle's idea, but on a universal scale.
In a way, yes. Our inherent rationality compels us to live together, to form communities based on shared ethical principles derived from that same universal reason. This is a direct rejection of the Epicurean view that the state is purely conventional, just a contract.
So for Stoics, the state was natural, not just an artificial agreement.
Yes. The source perfectly encapsulates this with a quote from Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor. Quote, "The rational animal is consequently also a political social animal. It's in our nature to live in societies."
And this changes everything regarding political participation.
It does. Unlike the other schools, Stoicism argued that virtue, human excellence, is acquired as citizens and members of a society, not in withdrawal from it. This philosophical foundation provided a powerful basis for re-engaging with political life, for seeing it as a natural and even necessary sphere for human flourishing, even within the challenging context of empire.
And this brings us to their most significant contribution, the one that echoed down through Cicero and into Western thought, the concept of natural law.
This is the real heavyweight contribution. This is the nugget right here.
Explain it. If we're all rational and part of a rational universe,
Then it follows that there are ethical obligations, moral duties, that are discoverable by reason alone. We don't need divine revelation or specific cultural laws to know them. These obligations are universally valid. They apply to everyone, everywhere, at all times, because they exist by nature as part of that rational order. They aren't just invented by human convention or decreed by rulers. This is natural law.
so there are fundamental ethical rules that are just there, part of the fabric of the universe, knowable by anyone who uses their reason, like moral gravity.
Precisely. That's a good analogy. The source gives examples: it is naturally, universally wrong to harm another or to kill without just cause, regardless of what the local civil laws might say in Sparta or Persia or Rome. These are natural laws of moral reason, embedded in human consciousness itself and reflecting the larger rational ethical order of nature. They're inherent universal standards of right and wrong.
And this concept had a profound impact, didn't it? Particularly on Cicero and later Western legal and political thought.
Huge. Absolutely massive. It provided a foundation for universal ethics that didn't depend on, say, the complex metaphysical system of Plato's forms, which maybe only philosophers could grasp. Natural law, according to the Stoics, was accessible to all who could reason. It was democratic in that sense.
And it also reaffirmed that classical Greek idea of the unity of ethics politics, didn't it?
Yes, very strongly. Like Plato and Aristotle, Stoicism argues that the state, the political community, must be grounded in these universal ethical principles derived from natural law. The state has an ethical purpose to promote justice and virtue that goes beyond mere self-preservation or mutual protection, which was the limited view of the Epicureans.
And the absolutely crucial consequence, the one the source really highlights and becomes central to Cicero's whole argument later on. Civil law, the actual laws passed by governments, must conform to natural law.
This is vital. This is where the ethical theory connects directly to political practice and legitimacy. Civil law, or positive law as it's sometimes called, the laws on the books in any given society, must be in harmony with the principles of natural law.
So a law that violated natural law wouldn't be truly legitimate.
According to Stoic thought, no. The legitimacy of a state, its moral right to rule and command obedience, depends on its laws not violating these universal ethical principles. A state that, for instance, passed a law mandating the murder of a certain group of people would be fundamentally illegitimate according to natural law, regardless of the procedures used to pass that law.
So natural law sets the ethical boundaries for all human laws.
Exactly. Though it's broad enough, the source notes, to allow for considerable variation in how different societies implement those principles in their specific circumstances. But the core ethical standards are universal and unchanging.
Okay, so the ultimate object of a Stoic life then is living according to nature, or living according to reason.
Yes, because nature is this rational, ethical order. Living in accord with nature means living virtuously, aligning your will, your choices, your actions with the universal rational order. And since humans are naturally social creatures, living according to nature necessarily involves treating others well, basically, living by some version of the golden rule.
And while they also sought inner peace, like the Cynics and Epicureans, they had a very different take on external things like pleasure and pain, wealth and poverty.
Right. Inner peace, or apatheia, freedom from disturbing passions, achieved through virtue, was definitely the goal. But they strongly rejected the Epicurean idea that pleasure was the ultimate good or that pain was inherently evil.
So what were those things then?
They classified things like pleasure, pain, wealth, poverty, health, sickness, success, failure, even life and death itself as indifferent things, a diaphora.
Indifferent, meaning they don't matter at all.
Not quite that they don't matter, but that they are morally neutral. They have no bearing on your virtue or your happiness. They shouldn't be allowed to disturb your inner peace or your commitment to living virtuously. A good person can be poor and sick. A bad person can be rich and healthy. These things are external to what truly matters, which is your character.
Virtue then involves accepting fate, accepting these indifferent things when they happen.
Exactly. It involves recognizing that we only have true control over our own rational will, our judgments, our intentions, our responses, not over external circumstances. The wise Stoic accepts what is outside their control with equanimity and focuses on cultivating virtue within.
The source quotes Epictetus on this, right? Something about anxiety.
Yes, it's a powerful quote. If nothing beyond our will's control is either good or evil, and everything within our will's control depends entirely on ourselves, what room is left for anxiety? If only your choices matter for your well-being, why worry about things you can't control?
That emphasis on the inner person and accepting fate feels like it could pull back towards withdrawal from the world, though. Is there a tension there with the idea of political duty?
There certainly is a tension. It's something later Stoics, particularly those actually involved in Roman politics like Seneca or the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, definitely wrestled with. How do you maintain inner detachment while being responsible for governing an empire?
Yeah, that seems tough.
While Stoics believed the state was natural and political leaders had a duty to rule justly according to reason and natural law, The ideal of the morally independent, self-sufficient sage, undisturbed by externals, could sometimes feel at odds with the messy compromises, the focus on external events, and the potential for frustration inherent in political life.
So a balancing act.
A constant balancing act. However, crucially, unlike the other major Hellenistic schools, Stoicism did provide a powerful philosophical justification for engaging with the political world, for seeing public service as a duty rooted in nature and reason. And this made it uniquely relevant for thinkers like Cicero trying to navigate the treacherous political waters of the late Roman Republic.
And that brings us perfectly to the man himself, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Born 106 BC, living right through the twilight of the Roman Republic and the dawn of the empire. And as our sources clearly show, he deeply absorbed these Greek philosophical currents, especially Stoicism.
Cicero is absolutely the pivotal figure here. He's the conduit, the one who takes much of this rich, complex Greek tradition and brings it into the Roman context, applying it directly to the desperate political reality of his time.
Let's start with his background a bit. Born in 106 BC, as I said, and significantly not into the old patrician nobility, the families who had dominated Rome for centuries. He was from the equestrian class.
Right, the equites, a kind of lower aristocracy, often wealthy landowners or businessmen, but outside the traditional senatorial elite.
So his rise was based on talent, not birthright.
Absolutely. It was his formidable intellect, his incredible skill as an orator and lawyer, and his ambition that propelled him forward. He had a top-notch education, too, not just in Rome, but he traveled, studied in the great Greek intellectual centers of Athens and Rhodes.
So he really soaked up Greek philosophy at the source.
He absolutely did. He encountered all the major schools, the Hellenistic ones we've discussed, but also the older traditions. He actually considered himself primarily a follower of Plato's academy.
Oh, interesting. Not a Stoic, primarily.
Well, the Academy in his day had adopted a form of skepticism, questioning the possibility of absolute certainty. So he wasn't a dogmatic Platonist. But he drew heavily on Plato and Aristotle and Polybius, and especially on Stoicism, particularly its ethics and the idea of natural law. The source calls him an eclectic.
Meaning he picked and chose from different schools.
Yeah, synthesized ideas, yeah. Perhaps the greatest Roman eclectic. He pulled together strands from Stoicism, the academic tradition, Aristotelianism, and the historian Polybius, weaving them into his own understanding of philosophy and politics.
But his ultimate goal, the sources stress, wasn't to be a purely abstract scholar-philosopher sitting in an ivory tower. He aimed to be something else.
A statesman-philosopher. This is crucial to his identity and his work. He saw philosophy not as an end in itself, but as essential preparation and guidance for a life of active political service.
How did that differ from, say, Plato's ideal of the philosopher king?
It's a key difference. Cicero, influenced by that academic skepticism, didn't believe humans could attain the kind of absolute, certain knowledge of the forms that Plato envisioned. So he didn't think a ruler could or should try to make the political order perfectly conform to some abstract blueprint.
So what was his ideal then?
His ideal was the practical statesman, someone deeply knowledgeable about philosophy and ethics, especially natural law, but also skilled in rhetoric, law, and the practical arts of governance. Someone who could take the messy political facts on the ground and use their skill and wisdom to direct them towards ethically appropriate ends, towards justice, as defined by reason and natural law.
And because of this practical focus, he actually ranked the statesman higher than the pure philosopher.
He did, which might surprise us. The source quotes him arguing that the statesman, quote, "Through his laws, he obliges all men to adopt that course which only a mere handful can be persuaded to adopt by the arguments of philosophers."
So the statesman makes virtue happen in the real world?
That was his view. The statesman has the power to translate ethical principles into concrete laws and actions that shape society for the better, impacting everyone, not just a philosophical elite.
But despite his immense skills as an orator, lawyer, and politician, his statesmanship ultimately failed him, didn't it? The Republic wasn't saved.
And tragically so. It's the great tragedy of his life. He rose to the highest office, consul, purely on merit, which was a remarkable achievement for a new man, novus homo, like him, but he lived through the absolute death throes of the Republic.
He was surrounded by powerful military figures.
Exactly. Men like Pompey, his sometime ally, sometime rival, Crassus, and above all, Julius Caesar, who became his greatest nemesis. And after Caesar's death, Mark Antony and Octavian, who would become Augustus. These were military men, commanders of loyal legions.
And Cicero.
Cicero was a civilian statesman steeped in philosophy and republican ideals. His power base was his eloquence, his legal skill, his network of influence, his moral authority, but he didn't command armies. And in the end, military force trumped constitutional principles.
He became increasingly isolated, didn't he? Trying to defend a system that was just crumbling around him under the weight of these powerful individuals and their armies.
Terribly isolated. And his eventual assassination in 43 BC, hunted down and killed on Mark Antony's orders after Cicero delivered blistering speeches against him, was a chilling and brutal symbol of the Republic's violent end.
So what exactly was this republic, this res publica, that Cicero fought so desperately and ultimately died trying to save?
It's important to define it. The source explains res publica literally means the public thing or the people's affair.
Yeah.
It implies a form of government characterized by some degree of popular participation, liberty, and the rule of law, as opposed to the arbitrary rule of a monarch or tyrant. It's about including citizens in a common enterprise for the public good, a commonwealth.
Distinct from Plato's ideal state, which rejected popular rule.
Very distinct. Cicero embraced the Republican tradition. However, it's also crucial to understand that Cicero's ideal wasn't a modern mass democracy with universal suffrage and full civil rights for everyone.
No, what was it then?
Our source characterizes it as an aristocratic republic, something perhaps closer in spirit to the vision of the American founders. It required a wise, experienced, virtuous political class, largely drawn from the aristocracy and property classes to provide leadership. It assumed inequalities and didn't include everyone in the political nation in the way we'd think of today.
And the core problem, the fundamental challenge he seemed unable or unwilling to fully confront, was that this Roman Republic was essentially a city-state model trying to govern a vast, sprawling empire.
This is the critical historical context the source keeps emphasizing. The Republic's institutions, the Senate, the assemblies, the magistracies, they evolved when Rome was just a city or at most controlled Italy. They were designed for a smaller, more homogeneous community where direct participation, or at least representation, was feasible.
But by Cicero's time, Rome controlled most of the Mediterranean world.
Exactly. Italy, Greece, North Africa, Spain, parts of Gaul, Asia Minor. Governing such a vast, diverse territory, with legions stationed thousands of miles away, without modern communication and transportation, made the kind of direct political engagement and shared community required for a meaningful republic incredibly difficult, perhaps even impossible.
So the pressures of empire were pushing towards a different form of rule.
Arguably, yes. The rise of monarchy, the centralized power of the Principate under Augustus, might have been an almost inevitable adaptation to the sheer scale and complexity of governing the empire. Just as monarchy had become the norm in the Hellenistic empires that preceded Rome.
And Cicero, perhaps tragically, remained committed to preserving the old republican model, even as its historical context, the city-state context, had evaporated.
That's certainly the perspective our sources lean towards. He was trying to restore a system that was, in many ways, no longer fit for purpose, given the reality of empire.
What was his grand plan, his strategy to restore and save the republic?
His strategy centered on achieving what he called a concordia ordinum, a harmony, an alliance between the different social orders or classes.
A harmony between who?
He hoped to build a coalition uniting the Senate, the traditional elite, the increasingly powerful propertied middle classes, the equestrians, his own class, whom Aristotle had also identified as crucial for political stability, and generally all responsible citizens, the boni, the good men, supporters of moderate republican rule across Italy.
And the Senate was absolutely central to this vision, wasn't it?
Fundamentally, the Senate, composed as it was of life-tenured ex-magistrates, was seen by Cicero as the repository of Rome's accumulated political wisdom, experience, tradition, and skill. Cicero, himself an ex-consul and a leading senator, believed this body was the key institution, the anchor, that could provide the necessary leadership and stability to guide the Republic back to health.
But it sounds like the Senate, in reality, ultimately failed him. They didn't step up.
The sources are quite clear on this point. For a complex mix of reasons, including internal divisions, short-sightedness, a narrow focus on preserving their own privileges and class interests, the Senate proved unwilling or unable to make the necessary reforms.
Reforms like what?
Like genuinely accommodating the growing power and aspirations of the middle classes, the equestrians, or addressing the deep social and economic problems caused by Rome's expansion. They resisted change, clung to their prerogatives.
And this internal paralysis, this failure of the traditional elite, created a power vacuum.
Precisely. It weakened the traditional Republican institutions and created an opening that was inevitably filled by powerful military leaders, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and ultimately Caesar, who commanded the personal loyalty of their armies, a power base independent of the Senate and the Constitution.
And the Republic, as a functioning system, effectively ended, replaced eventually by Augustus's Principate.
Yes, the Principate, a system of monarchical rule, cleverly disguised, at least initially, behind the facade, the forms of the old republic. It was a governmental structure far better suited, arguably, to the practical task of governing a vast empire.
And for a time, Cicero's writings, so explicitly pro-Republic, were suppressed, weren't they?
They were. After his death, under the Triumvirate and then Augustus, his defense of the Republic was dangerous talk. His political project had clearly failed.
So the immediate impact of Cicero, the statesman, wasn't successful. His enduring importance lies elsewhere.
Exactly. His political project failed in his lifetime. His lasting importance, as the source emphasizes again and again, lies in his role as a political thinker. He took that profound tradition of Greek philosophy, stretching back through Plato and Aristotle and incorporating the Hellenistic schools, and used it as a framework to analyze, understand, and articulate the principles of Roman politics and law.
He's the bridge builder again.
He's the crucial bridge builder, transmitting this incredible intellectual legacy forward into the Roman world and through Latin into the medieval and modern West.
And it's almost ironic, isn't it, that his most important philosophical works, the ones we study today, were written during periods when his political career was stalled or he was forced into retirement.
It's deeply ironic and fortunate for posterity, certainly. The source notes that major works like De Republica on the Commonwealth and De Legibus on the laws were undertaken during these enforced lulls in his active political life. A source of immense frustration for Cicero, the ambitious statesman, no doubt, but an incredible gift to the future of Western political and legal thought.
Okay, let's dive into the ideas themselves then. Let's unpack the core concepts from De Republica, starting with his foundational definition of the Commonwealth and its connection to justice. This seems central.
It absolutely is, and Cicero approaches the state from that classical perspective, thinking about the ethical ideal, the best and most just form of political organization, just like Plato and the Greek tradition before him.
He even modeled his books on Plato's, didn't he? De Republica and De Legibus, echoing Plato's Republican laws.
Very consciously. The titles, the dialogue format, the whole approach of inquiring into the ideal state, it's all deeply influenced by Plato. But as you mentioned, there are key differences reflecting his Roman context and perhaps his more practical, skeptical outlook.
Like the role of law.
Exactly. For instance, Cicero's laws describes the actual laws for his ideal state, the mixed constitution he champions in De Republica. It's not a second-best compromise like Plato's laws was for his philosopher-king ideal. And crucially, Cicero's ideal state has law as its foundation. For Romans, with their incredibly strong legal tradition, a state without law, ruled solely by the wisdom of philosopher-kings, as in Plato's Republic, was simply unthinkable, almost sacrilegious. Law was paramount.
Okay, so he starts De Republica with that famous definition of the Commonwealth, the res publica. It's delivered by the character Scipio Aemilianus, who seems to embody Cicero's ideal statesman-philosopher figure, right? Part of that influential Scipionic circle.
Yes. Scipio is his mouthpiece for many key ideas, and this definition is arguably one of the most influential in the entire history of political thought. The source quotes Scipio defining the Commonwealth, the res publica, as the people's affair.
Res publica equals people's affair.
Okay, Scipio continues. And the people is not every group of men associated in any manner, but is the coming together of a considerable number of men who are united by a common agreement about law and rights, consensus juris, and by the desire to participate in mutual advantages, utilitatis communione.
Let's unpack that. The people's affair, that sounds simple, but it carries a lot of weight, doesn't it? It's not the king's affair or the elite's affair.
It absolutely does. It immediately establishes that the political community, the Commonwealth, belongs to the whole community, not just the rulers or a dominant faction. It implies shared ownership, shared responsibility, regimes based purely on force or the interests of a narrow group. The source mentions the Third Reich or Stalinist Russia as modern examples where that genuine community and shared values about law and rights were absent. They wouldn't qualify as commonwealth under this definition. They weren't the people's affair.
And while the quote uses men, which reflects the conventions of his time,
and which we would obviously reject today.
A source rightly points out that if you strip away that patriarchal language, you reveal a powerful, inherently inclusive idea that the country, the political entity, is our affair, belonging to everyone who is part of that community, defined by shared law and rights.
It's a foundation for arguing for inclusion, even if Cicero didn't take it all the way by modern standards.
Okay, what about the other parts? United by a common agreement about law and rights, consensus iuris. What does that entail?
It's more than just living in the same geographical area or being ruled by the same government. It requires a shared understanding and acceptance of the fundamental rules of the game, the legal system, the basic rights and duties of citizens, the principles of justice that underpin the community. It implies shared political values.
And the desire to participate in mutual advantages, utilitatis communinae.
That points to the perceived benefit of belonging to the political order. People need to see value in the social and political cooperation, believe that it serves their common good, offers security, prosperity, justice, things they couldn't achieve alone. It requires a sense of shared purpose and mutual benefit.
So a commonwealth needs both a shared sense of justice and a sense of shared advantage.
Exactly. It's built on both ethical agreement and practical utility.
And this shared foundation, particularly the consensus iuris, the agreement on law and rights, it points towards a natural basis for the commonwealth, doesn't it? Contrasting sharply with that Epicurean view of the state as just an artificial contract based on fear.
Absolutely. If the community rests on shared values regarding law and rights, then humans must be, in some fundamental way, political and ethical creatures by nature inclined towards community living and justice.
Cicero makes that explicit.
Yes. The source quotes Scipio directly addressing this. The original cause of this coming together to form a commonwealth is not so much weakness as a kind of social instinct natural to man, quidam naturalis congregatio. We come together not just because we're scared or weak, but because we are naturally social.
That sounds perfectly in line with Aristotle's idea of humans as political animals.
It is. Cicero is consciously placing himself in that classical tradition. He emphasizes the social and ethical basis of political life, reaffirming the unity of ethics and politics, and explicitly rejecting the purely conventional, fear-based contractual view of the state championed by the Epicureans and other Hellenistic thinkers like the skeptics.
But the dialogue doesn't just present Cicero's view. It includes a skeptical challenge to this whole idea, doesn't it? Presented by the character Philus, arguing that justice and law are just conventions, not natural at all.
Right. Cicero fairly presents the counter-argument. Philus takes on the role of Carneades, a famous head of Plato's Academy in its skeptical phase, who had apparently shocked Romans on a visit by arguing for and against justice on consecutive days.
What's the core of Philus's skeptical argument?
It's a powerful empirical argument. Look around the world, laws and customs vary wildly from place to place, time to time. What's considered just in one society is condemned in another. If there were a universal natural justice, wouldn't laws be basically the same everywhere?
The variation suggests there's no single natural standard.
That's the inference. The sheer diversity of laws seems to prove that law has no basis, no sanction in nature. And if law isn't natural, Philus concludes, then it follows, then, that men are not just by nature. Justice itself is just a human invention.
And people obey these invented laws. Why?
Out of prudence, out of fear of punishment, not because they believe the laws are inherently right or just. It's about avoiding negative consequences.
So this leads directly back to that contractual, self-interested view of the state we saw with the Epicureans. People unite not out of sociability, but out of weakness and fear.
Yes, Philus argues exactly that. Neither nature nor deliberate choice, but weakness is the mother of justice. The state and the justice it enforces is simply a pragmatic compact driven by fear and the desire for self-preservation, protecting us from each other's antisocial tendencies. He even claims Scipio's ideal state, despite all the noble talk about shared values, is ultimately just this kind of conventional contract in disguise.
It's a strong challenge. How does Cicero, speaking through the character Laelius this time, respond? How does he defend the natural basis of the Commonwealth and justice?
Laelius firmly rejects this skeptical contractual view. He argues that the common agreement about law and rights, consensus iuris, that defines the Commonwealth, isn't a mere contract born of weakness or fear, it's something deeper.
Deeper how?
It's an implicit understanding, almost an a priori category of human consciousness that stems directly from our inherently social and ethical nature, from our capacity for reason. The Commonwealth, the political community, is therefore natural, rooted in human nature itself, not just a conventional arrangement.
And this is where the Stoic concept of natural law provides the absolutely essential foundation for his counterargument.
Absolutely. Laelius then articulates the classic Stoic natural law position, which becomes Cicero's own definitive stance. He says, there is in fact a true law, namely right reason, which is in accordance with nature, applies to all men, and is unchangeable and eternal.
Right reason. In accordance with nature, applying to all, unchanging, eternal. That's the core.
Yes. He emphasizes its universality. It applies everywhere, not one rule at Rome and another at Athens, nor will it be one rule today and another tomorrow. It transcends local customs and laws.
And the profound practical consequence of this, which becomes a cornerstone of Western legal philosophy, largely thanks to Cicero.
The crucial consequence is that to invalidate this law by human legislation is never morally right. Human civil law, the laws passed by states, must align with and must not contradict the fundamental precepts of natural law. Natural law provides the ultimate ethical standard against which all human laws must be judged. That's the core Stoic argument that Cicero adopts.
So Cicero firmly plants his flag here. He roots himself squarely in the classical tradition. The state and law are natural. They reflect or should reflect universal justice, and ethics and politics are fundamentally intertwined.
He sees the political community and its laws as expressions of human nature at its best, guided by reason and the rational order of the universe, not merely as pragmatic agreements based on fear or self-interest.
Okay. The sources also make an important theoretical distinction that Cicero uses, one that became quite important in later Western thought. The difference between the Commonwealth, res publica, and the state, civitas. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's a subtle but useful conceptual tool. The Commonwealth, res publica, as we just defined it, is the political community itself, the people united by those shared values about law and rights, consensus iuris, and mutual advantage, utilitatis communione. It's the substance, the body politic.
And the state, civitas.
The state, or civitas, which can also mean citizenship or the city itself, but here means the organized political structure, is the formal organization of that community. It's the legal and political framework, the constitution, the government, the laws necessary for the Commonwealth to function, endure, and achieve its purposes.
So the state is like the organizational skeleton that holds the Commonwealth, the living body, together.
That's a great way to put it. As Scipio explains in the dialogue, the civitas is an organization of the people which needs to be ruled by some deliberating authority in order that it may endure. You need the structure to preserve the substance.
And this theoretical separation allows you to distinguish between the enduring community and its potentially changing organizational structure.
Exactly. It became important later, for instance, in distinguishing the nation or the people from the particular form of government they happen to have at any given time.
And the logical conclusion, connecting this back to his main argument, is that the ideal state, civitas, the best form of government, is the one best designed to maintain and preserve the Commonwealth, res publica, as the people's affair, based on law, justice, and shared values.
That's the crucial link. The structure must serve the purpose of the community. This raises the next critical question for Cicero. What specific constitutional structure, what type of state, is most likely to achieve and maintain this ideal commonwealth based on law and justice?
Which brings us perfectly to our sixth section, exploring Cicero's answer, his famous argument for the composite or mixed constitution, and the considerable challenges he faced in trying to realize it.
Right. So having defined the ideal commonwealth, Cicero asks, what form of government is best suited to uphold it? And like many classical thinkers before him, Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, he rejected the simple, pure forms of government.
The standard three, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Why reject them?
Because they are inherently unstable and tend to degenerate into their corrupt counterparts. Monarchy, ruled by one, easily devolves into tyranny, ruled by one in their own self-interest, disregarding law and the people.
Okay.
Aristocracy, ruled by the best, aristoi, tends to become oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy few in their narrow class interest.
Got it.
And democracy, ruled by the many, demos, risks collapsing into mob rule or ochlocracy, where the passions and whims of the crowd overwhelm reason, deliberation, justice, and the rights of minorities. Simple forms, the source notes, almost inevitably become based on the selfish class interests of the rulers, whoever they are, rather than the public good, the people's affair.
So they lack balance and are prone to corruption.
Yeah.
What's the solution then, according to Cicero?
The solution, he argues, following Polybius most directly, is to combine elements of these simple forms into a composite or mixed state, constitutio mixta.
How does that help?
By mixing monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic principles and institutions within the same constitution, the different elements can act as checks and balances on each other. They can prevent any one person, group, or principle from becoming too dominant and degenerating into its corrupt form.
So mixing them creates stability and prevents tyranny.
That's the theory. He believed this mixing would ensure both governmental stability and the preservation of liberty by balancing the strengths of each simple form while mitigating their weaknesses.
And he saw this ideal mix embodied in the actual institutions of the Roman Republic, at least in its best days.
Yes, he mapped these abstract principles directly onto the Roman constitution. The popular assemblies, where citizens voted on laws and elected magistrates, represented the democratic principle.
Okay.
The magistrates, particularly the higher ones like consuls and praetors, along with the Senate itself, embodied the aristocratic principle ruled by experienced, knowledgeable elites. And the monarchical principle, the element of strong executive leadership, he saw represented either by a single guiding figure, a rector or princeps, which he discusses somewhat vaguely in De Republica, or more concretely, by the power of the two consuls, the chief executives, which seems to be his more settled view, especially in Delectabus.
The goal of this complex arrangement was to strike a balance.
Precisely. To balance liberty derived from the democratic processes with wisdom and prudent leadership derived from the aristocratic and monarchical elements. It was also implicitly about balancing the interests of the different classes within the state, with the magistrates often drawn from the dominant educated groups.
Now, this idea of a mixed constitution, balancing different principles and classes, sounds very similar to Aristotle's concept in the Politics. But the source says Cicero's direct influence here came more from Polybius.
That's an important nuance. While the idea has Aristotelian roots, Polybius, the Greek historian who lived in Rome for a time and was part of that Scipionic circle Cicero admired, was the immediate source.
What was Polybius's argument?
Polybius's major thesis in his History of Rome was that Rome's extraordinary success, its rise to dominate the Mediterranean, was precisely due to its unique, historically evolved mixed constitution. He argued that this balance of consular, monarchical, senatorial, aristocratic, and popular democratic power was the key to Rome's stability, resilience, and military might. Cicero basically adopts Polybius's analysis.
And this is where Cicero does something quite original, methodologically speaking.
Hmm.
He locates his ideal state not in some abstract theoretical model like Plato did, but in the actual historical evolution of the Roman constitution itself.
This is absolutely key to his approach, which he gets from Polybius. He follows the classical Greek pattern of distinguishing the ideal from the real, right? But unlike Plato, who creates an entirely new imaginary city in words, Callipolis, as the ideal benchmark,
Right.
Cicero finds the ideal within the historical development of the real Roman polity. The ideal isn't separate from history, it's revealed through history, specifically Roman history.
How does he make that argument? How can he claim that Rome's messy, historically evolved constitution is the ideal? It seems counterintuitive.
He argues that by analyzing Rome's historical evolution, from its mythical beginnings under kings through the struggles of the early republic, we can see how the composite form gradually emerged. And at its peak, what he calls the strength and vigor of its maturity, likely referring to the period before the destabilizing Gracchi reforms, maybe the mid-2nd century BC, this mixed constitution successfully combined the positive features of the simpler forms while mitigating their tendencies toward excess and degeneration. The ideal is revealed by studying the historical process of the real.
So history itself validates the Roman model.
That's his claim. The source quotes Scipio explicitly stating his plan in De Republica. I shall picture a commonwealth at the moment of its birth, in the course of its development, and then in the strength and vigor of its maturity, instead of arbitrarily creating an imaginary state, as Socrates does in Plato's Republic. He's grounding his ideal in Roman history, not abstract reason alone.
But here's the massive and truly tragic problem the source keeps hammering home. By Cicero's own day, the actual Roman Republic he lived in was clearly not ideal. It was the opposite.
That's the gaping hole in the argument, the dramatic irony that haunts his life and work. The reality he confronted daily was rotten to the core, plagued by endemic corruption, bitter class conflict turning violent, political paralysis, the rise of warlords, and heading rapidly towards outright tyranny and empire. The very opposite of his definition of a true commonwealth based on law, justice, and shared values.
So, if the contemporary reality was so corrupt, how could the ideal still be found within that reality's history? How does he reconcile the ideal past with the rotten present?
Cicero's explanation for this decline, for the gap between the historical ideal and the present decay, focuses heavily, almost exclusively, on a decline in the character of the leadership, particularly the Senate.
It's a moral failing, not a structural one.
That's his primary diagnosis. He attributes the Republic's decline not to a fundamental flaw in the mixed constitution itself, but to defects of character, a loss of the traditional Roman virtues, mos maiorum, among the political elite. He famously laments that Rome had long since lost the substance of the Commonwealth, though we still retain its name, because the ruling class had abandoned the integrity, discipline, and public spiritedness necessary to uphold it.
This emphasis on the quality of the rulers sounds very classical, doesn't it? Like Plato's idea that the decline of the ideal state is driven by the degeneration of its rulers' souls.
It's very much in that classical tradition. The health of the state depends on the virtue of its leaders. The difference, of course, is that Cicero's ideal rulers are practical statesmen operating within a legal framework, not detached philosopher kings ruling by pure wisdom. But the core ideal leadership character is key, is similar.
So for Cicero, the practical statesman, restoring the Republic wasn't about radically reinventing the system, but about somehow restoring the character and authority of its traditional institutions and leaders, especially the Senate. What kind of knowledge did he think these statesmen needed to achieve this?
Not the purely theoretical, abstract knowledge of forms that Plato required. Cicero was too pragmatic, too skeptical for that, but they needed more than just cunning political expediency, realpolitik. The ideal statesman, Cicero argues, needs to understand politics as a dynamic process, a cycle of changes, as Polybius had described. The ideal isn't a static endpoint to be achieved once and for all.
Politics is always in motion.
Always. The source quotes Scipio saying the statesman must be able to foresee impending modifications and at the same time to pilot the state, to direct its course, and to keep it under control.
It sounds very much like navigating a ship through constantly changing seas. It requires practical skill, foresight, but also a sense of direction, a destination.
Exactly. It's a deeply conservative approach. In the Burkean sense, focused on understanding the existing institutions, preserving what's best in them, guiding their evolution, reforming them carefully where necessary, rather than trying to impose an abstract blueprint from scratch. The statesman grasps the ideal that is implicit within the historical reality of the state and works skillfully to guide the state towards that ideal.
And that ideal, that destination, rooted in the classical tradition, is ultimately justice.
Justice is the guiding star.
But how does the statesman know this justice? Is it just by looking at existing institutions, which Cicero himself admits are corrupt? That seems circular. Or is there something else?
Right, that's a potential problem.
Mm-hmm.
While observing the best aspects of the historically evolved Roman constitution can provide some clues to the ideal, Cicero recognizes that's not enough, especially when the present reality is flawed. He still uses Plato's abstract ideal as a kind of benchmark sometimes. But the source highlights that the more important way the statesman knows justice, the ultimate ethical compass, is through natural law.
Ah, the Stoic connection again. It's the bedrock.
It's absolutely essential for his political theory to hold together. The source quotes Scipio emphasizing that the ideal statesman must be perfectly versed in natural law, for without this no man can be just. Natural law provides the universal, unchanging first principles of justice. The fundamental ethical framework that ensures politics is more than just a chaotic struggle for power or based on mere expediency.
So natural law provides the ethical direction, the ought.
Yeah.
And civil law provides the practical means.
Precisely. The statesman also needs a thorough knowledge of civil law, the specific, practical rules, procedures, and institutions of their own state. Not to be enslaved by them, the source notes Scipio warning, but to adapt to their own uses but never allow to be an obstacle. Civil law varies by culture and history, reflecting specific circumstances, but it must ultimately accord with and serve the ends of the universal principles of natural law.
So the ideal statesman needs both. Absolute knowledge of natural law for ethical direction and practical knowledge of civil law for effective implementation within their specific context.
That's the combination Cicero advocates. Philosophical depth combined with practical skill.
Okay, this brings us logically to De Legibus, on the laws, where he moves from the ideal structure in De Republica to outlining the specific laws needed for this ideal commonwealth. And here, the source emphasizes the crucial role he assigns to the magistrates. Let's get into section 7.
Right. In De Legibus, Cicero aims to specify the legal framework that would sustain the ideal mixed constitution he developed in De Republica. And for him, law isn't just a collection of technical rules or prohibitions. It's the concrete expression of the entire political system's underlying philosophy and ethical purpose.
He saw law as much more central, perhaps, than even the Greek thinkers did.
He certainly elevated its importance. He saw law as deriving, as the character Atticus says in the dialogue, from the deepest mysteries of philosophy, not just from the pragmatic edicts of magistrates or the formulas of priests.
And he felt that his Roman contemporaries, despite being famous for their legal expertise, were actually missing this deeper philosophical dimension.
He did. He lamented that Roman lawyers and politicians of his day often treated law purely pragmatically as a tool for winning cases, gaining advantage, or maintaining order rather than contemplating its connection to universal justice and natural reason. Cicero consciously aimed to make the study and practice of law more philosophical, integrating Greek theory, especially Stoic natural law, with the practical, pragmatic Roman legal mind.
So how did he define law itself at its most fundamental level, not just the laws on the books?
His primary philosophical definition is that law, lex, is the highest reason, ratio summa, implanted in nature, which commands what ought to be done and forbids the opposite. Law, at its core, is natural moral reason itself.
Reason applied to telling us what to do and not do.
Exactly. He calls it right reason applied to command and prohibition. Civil law, the specific laws of a state, is simply this natural, rational law expressed through human commands and prohibitions, often backed by the coercive power of the state, sanctions, punishments.
He sums it up beautifully in a quote the source provides. Law is the distinction between things just and unjust, made in agreement with that primal and most ancient of all things, nature.
And in conformity to nature's standard are framed those human laws which inflict punishment upon the wicked but defend and protect the good. It clearly links human law to natural, universal justice.
But again, couldn't someone make that skeptical argument here? That law is only about the coercion, the punishment, that the justice part is just window dressing for state power.
That's precisely the challenge that hangs over Cicero's entire project, the argument from the Hellenistic schools like the Epicureans and skeptics. If law is only an instrument of state coercion, obeyed out of fear, then law and the state become purely conventional, artificial constructs. Natural law becomes meaningless, a philosophical fantasy, and justice itself becomes just a name we give to whatever the dominant power or prevailing interests manage to enforce. This view would utterly dismantle Cicero's philosophy.
It would undermine his core belief that humans have an innate sense of justice.
Completely. It would undermine his claim that we are so constituted by nature as to share the sense of justice with one another and to pass it on to all men. So, by defining law as inherently moral and rational, rooted in nature, Cicero is making a profound statement. He's asserting a whole political philosophy based on reason, nature, and shared justice.
And this perspective is quintessentially Roman, isn't it? Taking something fundamental to Roman identity law and giving it this deep philosophical grounding derived from Greek thought.
Absolutely. He philosophizes about politics from the perspective of law. His commonwealth, remember, is united by a common agreement about law and right.
Leading him to state clearly in De Legibus, as the source quotes, those who share law must also share justice, and those who share these are to be regarded as members of the same commonwealth.
Yes. The shared legal system is the bond of the community. And because for Cicero law is inherently tied to justice, a true commonwealth must be a just commonwealth, a people's affair. An unjust law for him is almost a contradiction in terms. It's not truly law in the highest philosophical sense.
Okay. Now, while many of the specific laws he proposes in De Legibus are very tied to the Roman context of his time and might seem less relevant today, for instance, the detailed regulations regarding the state religion.
Right. That reflects the classical city-state focus. Unlike modern societies that often emphasize a separation of church and state, religion in the Roman Republic was a public political institution, crucial for maintaining social cohesion and tradition. His laws for religion reflect that reality.
The laws that are of most interest for political theory, the source argues, are those that shape the constitutional structure itself, particularly those concerning the magistrates.
Absolutely. Cicero himself states that after the laws concerning religion, the laws concerning magistrates are surely the most important in the formation of a commonwealth, because the whole character of a republic is determined by its arrangements in regard to magistrates.
Why are they so important?
Because the magistrates are the primary governing agents. They embody the monarchical and aristocratic elements of his composite state. They wield the actual power of government. And they were central to Cicero's hopes for reforming the Republic. Getting the right kind of people into these offices, acting virtuously, was key.
What's their primary function in his ideal state, according to his proposed laws?
Their function is to govern and to give commands which are just and beneficial and in conformity with the law. Simple enough, but loaded. In the ideal system, their commands must align with the civil laws of Rome, which themselves should conform to the principles of universal natural law.
And crucially, the magistrate isn't above the law they enforce.
This is an absolute cornerstone of the rule of law, and Cicero emphasizes it strongly. His famous formulation is, quote, "As the laws govern the magistrate, so the magistrate governs the people." It establishes a clear hierarchy. Natural law governs civil law governs the magistrate, and the magistrate governs the people. Everyone is under the law.
Leading to that incredibly powerful and often quoted line, "The magistrate is a speaking law, and the law a silent magistrate."
It's beautiful, isn't it? It perfectly encapsulates the ideal. The magistrate's authority derives entirely from the law. They are merely the voice, the instrument, giving effect to the law's commands. It asserts the supremacy of law, and by extension for Cicero, the supremacy of justice and reason.
But it relies on a big assumption.
It absolutely does. It presumes that magistrates understand and accept that they are subordinate to the law, and that the fundamental purpose of law is to preserve the Commonwealth as a just, shared enterprise. A presumption Cicero bitterly knew that had been dangerously forgotten by much of the political elite in his own day.
The arrangement of magistrates within the mixed composite state is supposed to be the mechanism that ensures they rule in the name of law, preventing power from becoming arbitrary or concentrated.
That's the theoretical benefit of the structure. If you concentrate power in one magistrate or a single group, you get those simple forms of government, monarchy, oligarchy, that are prone to degeneration and tyranny. By balancing different types of offices, powers, and terms, the mixed constitution prevents this slide, forcing cooperation and adherence to legal processes.
And Cicero believed that the historically evolved Roman constitution, complex and perhaps accidental as its evolution was, had at one point actually achieved this ideal balance.
Yes, he saw it as the result of centuries of experience and adaptation, not abstract design. He quotes Scipio saying the system devised by their ancestors had no innovations, or at least only a few, which I thought ought to be introduced into the Constitution.
He believed the blueprint was already there, in Rome's own past. The problem wasn't the design, but the execution, the corruption. The task was restoration, not invention.
That was his fundamental belief, yes.
Okay, let's look closer now at two key types of Roman magistrates that the source highlights in our next section, Section 8. The consuls and the tribunes. They seem to really embody the core constitutional tensions and the class conflicts of the Roman Republic.
They absolutely do. They represent the poles of the system in many ways. The consuls were the pinnacle of the traditional power structure.
The chief executives.
Yes, two consuls elected annually. The source says 2 years in one spot, but annually is standard, perhaps a typo in the notes, serving as the supreme executive power. They held immense authority command of the armies, imperium, significant judicial functions, the power to convene the Senate and assemblies, authority over most other magistrates. In De Legibus, they clearly represent that necessary monarchical element Cicero discussed, replacing the vaguer rector from De Republica.
Okay, so they're the top dogs representing the established order. Yeah. And the tribunes. They were created specifically as a counterbalance.
Exactly. The tribunes of the plebs, 10 of them, also elected annually, but crucially, elected by the assembly of the common people, the plebeians. Their office was established historically, after significant struggle, precisely to protect the common people from potential abuses by the consuls and the Senate, who traditionally represented the nobility, patricians, and later the combined patrician-plebeian senatorial elite.
And their power grew over time.
Significantly. Their most famous power was the veto, intercessio, the ability to block actions by magistrates or resolutions of the Senate that they deemed harmful to the plebeians. In Cicero's ideal republic, as outlined in De Legibus, he affirms that their prohibitions and resolutions passed by the plebeians under their presidency shall be binding. They were a powerful check.
So they clearly represent the democratic element in his composite state, elected by and for the people.
Primarily, yes, they presided over the plebeian assembly. However, it's worth noting, as the source points out, that by Cicero's day, tribunes had also gained the right to sit and speak in the Senate, which theoretically gave them a foot in the aristocratic camp as well, complicating the neat separation.
These two powerful offices, the consuls representing the traditional power structure and the tribunes representing the people's interests and power to resist, they seem like the direct constitutional reflection of the deep, often violent class conflict that ran through Roman history.
They are. The struggle between the nobility, the senatorial order, and the common people, the plebeians, and later the urban poor and rural farmers, was a defining feature of the Republic. Cicero, like Aristotle, looking at the factionalism in Greek city-states, hoped that a well-designed constitutional arrangement balancing these competing forces could channel this conflict away from violence and towards peaceful, legal resolutions achieving the rule of law despite deep social divisions.
But the source points out that by Cicero's day, the tribuneship itself had become problematic. It wasn't always just protecting the people. It was often used by ambitious individuals as a stepping stone to personal power, sometimes at the expense of republican stability.
Yes, that's a major point of tension that Cicero addresses directly in the dialogue De Legibus. His brother Quintus, playing devil's advocate perhaps, attacks the tribuneship, calling its very creation a great misfortune.
Why?
Quintus argues it led to the decline in the influence of the aristocracy and the growth of the power of the multitude, essentially blaming the tribunes for destabilizing the Republic by empowering the masses and undermining the authority of the Senate, a common conservative critique then and now.
But Cicero, speaking as himself in the dialogue, defends the office.
He mounts a strong defense. First, he appeals to tradition and the wisdom of our ancestors. He argues the office was created for a necessary reason in response to real oppression, and shouldn't be rejected wholesale just because it's been misused or caused difficulties later on.
He points out corruption wasn't limited to the tribunes.
Exactly. He says, look, the consulate has been corrupted too, but we don't abolish it. And given the nobility's historical tendency towards excessive power and arrogance, which led to popular rebellion, he argues the creation of the tribuneship was arguably the only salvation of the state at the time, preventing civil war.
What does he see as its core, essential purpose? Why is it indispensable?
For Cicero, the real enduring importance of the tribuneship lies in its role as the ultimate guarantor of the people's liberty. Libertas.
How so?
Without the tribune's power to check the consuls and the Senate, the unchecked power of the nobility would inevitably crush popular freedom. He argues the common people created the office precisely out of this fundamental passionate desire for liberty.
He makes a very strong statement connecting the abolition of monarchy to the necessity of liberty, doesn't he?
Yes, it's quite powerful. It is clear that either the monarchy ought never to have been abolished, or else that real liberty, not a pretense of it, had to be given to the common people. If you're going to have a republic, not a kingdom, then the people must have genuine freedom, and the tribuneship is the necessary instrument for that.
Okay, so consuls, monarchical, tribunes and assemblies, democratic. What about the Senate, the aristocratic element? What's its role in this balance?
The Senate is the fulcrum, the absolute linchpin of Cicero's ideal composite system. It acts as the primary check on both the power of the magistrates, like the consuls, and the potential excesses of the people's assemblies.
It's the stabilizing force.
Ideally, yes. Composed of experienced, life-tenured ex-magistrates, it's meant to be the repository of wisdom, tradition, and long-term perspective, essential for achieving that concordia ordinum, harmony of the orders, and guiding the state prudently. While it had specific legal powers, its real influence in the ideal system derived from its moral authority, its auctoritas.
And Cicero proposes a law for his ideal Senate, where its decrees shall be binding.
Yes, arguing that, in a healthy republic, the other elements, the magistrates and the people, should willingly uphold the Senate's decrees because the Senate embodies the rule of wisdom. They would recognize its superior judgment and experience.
This harmony would be helped by the tribunes also being in the Senate.
Theoretically, yes. Having the people's representatives participate in the Senate's deliberations should foster understanding and make the Senate's decisions more acceptable to the populace.
He sums up the ideal balance of power quite neatly.
He does. Supreme power, potestas, is granted to the people and actual authority, auctoritas, to the Senate. The people hold the ultimate legal sovereignty, electing magistrates, passing laws, but the Senate, through its wisdom and prestige, exercises the actual guiding authority in practice. That distinction, vesting real authority in the Senate, is the basis of his composite state, the key to enabling that balanced and harmonious constitution he sought.
Which brings us, inevitably, to our final section, Section 9, where we have to grapple with the flaws and ambiguities in Cicero's thought and try to assess his enduring influence despite his political failure. The huge problem, as the source notes repeatedly, is that the actual Senate in his day wasn't this font of wisdom and authority at all.
That's the stark, unavoidable reality that constantly undermines his theoretical ideal. The Senate, he knew, was often paralyzed by factionalism, consumed by petty rivalries, resistant to necessary reforms, and widely seen not as wise guides, but as a self-interested, often corrupt cabal clinging to power. Its decrees were increasingly ignored or bypassed. Its auctoritas had crumbled.
So when Cicero proposes a law for his ideal Senate, stating it shall be free from dishonor and shall be a model for the rest of the citizens, he's not describing reality. He's stating a desperate hope, a necessary condition for his system to work.
Exactly. It's purely prescriptive. He recognizes that achieving this ideal Senate, restoring its virtue and moral authority, is paramount. He even says, if we secure this, we shall have secured everything.
Why is the Senate's character so critical?
He makes a broader point, echoing Plato again. Just as the whole state is habitually corrupted by the evil desires and vices of its prominent men, so is it improved and reformed by self-restraint on their part.
The moral character of the ruling elite sets the tone for the entire society. Corruption at the top leads to general corruption. Virtue at the top can inspire reform.
So, fix the Senate's character, and you fix the Republic.
That's his core belief. The difference from Plato, again, is that Cicero's elite are supposed to be practical statesmen deriving their ultimate authority from the people and the Constitution, not detached philosopher rulers. But both agree. An ideal state requires the rule of wisdom embodied in an uncorrupted elite.
Okay, let's look again at the democratic element of the people's assemblies. In his model, they seem primarily legislative, but ultimately subordinate to the Senate and magistrates. And then there's that really controversial voting law he proposes in De Legibus. Can we revisit that? Ah, yes, the voting law. It's definitely one of the most problematic aspects of his theory from a modern perspective. He proposes a system where the vote shall not be concealed from citizens of high rank and shall be free to the common people.
Meaning, the nobles get to see how the commoners vote. No secret ballot.
Essentially, yes. While the common people are free to vote, their choice is public knowledge, at least to the elite magistrates and senators presiding over the assemblies. This obviously opens the door to intimidation, influence, and pressure.
From our standpoint today, where the secret ballot is considered absolutely essential for genuine democratic liberty and freedom from coercion, this sounds awful. What was his justification?
His stated justification is quite revealing of his aristocratic leanings. He argues that the people enjoy sufficient liberty if they have the power, through their vote, of honorably winning the favor of the aristocracy. It seems to imply a system where the people express their preferences, but under the watchful eye and guidance of their social superiors, maintaining a kind of deferential harmony.
The source acknowledges that Cicero wasn't advocating for pure democracy as we know it. His goal was a mixed republic with significant checks on popular power, perhaps similar in intent, though not mechanism, to the checks and balances the U.S. founders created.
Right. He feared unchecked popular rule, mob rule, as much as tyranny or oligarchy. But even within the context of his own goals for a balanced republic, the source strongly critiques this specific voting law. It argues the law goes too far, giving the senatorial class excessive power to influence or pressure voters, making the people's liberty insecure, perhaps illusory.
And Cicero himself seems to hint at this ambiguity.
He does. Scipio in De Republica, discussing a similar law, admits it grants the appearance of liberty more than the full reality. The source rightly calls this element of his theory troublesome and inconsistent with his defense of the tribuneship as necessary for real liberty.
So putting it together, overall criticisms of Cicero's political thought include this ambiguous, perhaps inadequate treatment of liberty and popular rule, and the real risk that the power vested in the magistrates and the Senate could overwhelm the democratic element, making it less of a true commonwealth inclusive of all classes, less of a genuinely balanced composite state than he claimed.
That's a very common scholarly assessment, yes. Many argue his composite state, despite the theory, leans too heavily towards the aristocratic element in practice, making the balance precarious. However, the source does offer some tempering points, noting that perhaps modifications to the voting law could address some criticisms, and reminding us again of his strong defense of the tribuneship as an essential protector of liberty. His intent wasn't necessarily to deprive the people of liberty, even if the structure he proposed had ambiguous or problematic elements.
But the most fundamental criticism the source levels against him, the one that perhaps explains his ultimate political failure, is that he failed to truly come to terms with the underlying structural reality of empire.
This is presented as the core issue, the blind spot. His proposed solution, essentially, reconstituting the virtue and authority of the Senate, is seen by the source as little more than a statement of the problem.
How so?
He identifies what needs to happen. The Senate needs to be virtuous and respected again. But he doesn't provide a realistic, concrete political plan for how to achieve this radical reformation of character and class relations in a deeply polarized, structurally transformed state. He talks about education and training for statesmen, but that presumes a willingness to be reformed that clearly wasn't there among the entrenched elite. Simply asserting the goal is not a practical solution.
And unlike Plato, who could detach his ideal state from messy reality and ultimately advocate philosophical withdrawal, Cicero couldn't really do that, could he? His whole method tied the ideal to Roman history.
Exactly. That's the trap of his Polybian, Aristotelian-influenced method. He located the ideal within the real historical evolution of the Roman polity. Therefore, his philosophy demanded validation in practice. He couldn't just dismiss the corrupt republic as irrelevant to his theory or withdraw into pure contemplation. His philosophy had to work in the real world.
But the source argues he never fully grasped the real structural cause of the republic's terminal decline.
Which was?
That Rome would become a vast empire. Its institutions, its political culture, its very principles, forged in the context of a small city-state, were simply inadequate, fundamentally unsuited for governing such a large, diverse, complex entity without modern communications and administrative structures. Monarchy, or something like it, as had happened in the earlier Hellenistic empires, was arguably the unavoidable political form for such a large-scale entity. So he remained intellectually and emotionally beholden to the small, city-state republican model of Rome's past, believing it was still viable, still the ideal, even when the conditions that supported it were gone.
That's the core argument. This failure, or perhaps refusal, to confront the new political facts on the ground, the reality of empire meant his ideal, based on the Republic's supposed maturity centuries earlier, was rooted in a kind of nostalgia for a past that was truly dead and gone.
His own method, finding the ideal in the real, arguably should have led him to modify his ideal state theory to fit the new reality of empire, but he couldn't, or wouldn't, make that leap.
He couldn't let go of the Republic as he idealized it, and consequently, his focus on Senate corruption as the primary cause of the decline was, in this view, misplaced. The corruption was arguably more a symptom or a result of the immense, perhaps impossible structural challenges of governing an empire using city-state institutions.
Which means his plan to simply reform the Senate's character, however desirable, was fundamentally inadequate to address the radical transformation Rome was undergoing. He was treating the symptom, not the disease.
That's the essence of the critique, yes.
So in terms of immediate political impact, his philosophy failed. It couldn't save the Republic.
That's undeniably true. In that sense, he's a bit like Aristotle, summing up the experience and ideals of the city-state political tradition just as that historical era was definitively ending. His philosophy, while profound, proved inadequate to provide immediate solutions for the new political reality of large-scale empire.
But and this is the huge, crucial but where his enduring importance comes in, that immediate political failure wasn't what ultimately mattered for subsequent Western thought.
This is his paradoxical legacy. Despite failing to save the republic he loved, his political philosophy, preserved in his writings, had an absolutely enormous, almost incalculable impact on later political thought.
Especially Republican and Democratic theories.
Hugely. Particularly from the Renaissance onwards, when thinkers started looking back to classical models to challenge medieval monarchies. Figures in the Italian city-states, Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu, the American founders, they all read Cicero deeply. Had he successfully adapted his thought to celebrate or justify empire, this powerful republican tradition, this language of commonwealth, liberty, and mixed government, wouldn't have had such a foundational authoritative text from Rome itself.
So as an eclectic, he became this crucial transmitter, preserving and passing on classical ideas.
Yes. He funneled so much of the Greek tradition, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, Polybius, into Latin in a clear, eloquent, and accessible form. This made these ideas available to the Roman world and, crucially, to later centuries in Western Europe when Greek texts were often lost or inaccessible.
Concepts like natural law, the Commonwealth as the people's affair, republicanism itself, their impact on the West, is significantly due to Cicero popularizing and articulating them.
Without a doubt. He wasn't always the originator, but he was often the crucial conduit.
Though the source does acknowledge the potential downside of eclecticism. He wasn't perhaps a groundbreakingly original thinker on the same level as a Plato or an Aristotle. He synthesized more than he created anew.
That's a fair assessment often made. He's not generally ranked among the very top tier of purely philosophical innovators. But the counterargument, which the source also offers, is that his genius lay in the imaginative integration of these diverse ideas, and his specific application of finding the ideal state within the historical evolution of the Roman constitution was an original and highly influential methodological approach. He made Greek ideas relevant to Roman experience.
So whether you see him primarily as a brilliant transmitter or as a creative synthesizer, his influence is simply undeniable.
Undeniable. The immediate political events, Caesar's dictatorship, the civil wars, Augustus establishing the Principate, made his republican ideas seem utterly irrelevant, even dangerous, in his own time and shortly after. His life ended in failure and proscription. Yet, centuries later, when political circumstances changed and people started rethinking the possibilities of self-government, liberty, and the rule of law, Cicero's works were there, waiting to be rediscovered. And they profoundly shaped the way Western civilization thought about politics.
What an incredible sweep of history and ideas we've covered today. It's really quite something. From the final fading days of the Greek city-state and the dramatic rise of these vast new empires.
Through the philosophical turn inward in response, the Hellenistic search for individual peace, and then Stoicism's crucial contribution of natural law as a universal ethical guide.
And then focusing in on Cicero himself, this brilliant, ambitious, ultimately tragic figure trying desperately to apply these classical and Hellenistic ideas, this blend of Greek philosophy and Roman tradition, to save his beloved Roman Republic from tearing itself apart.
We've explored his powerful vision of a commonwealth founded on a shared understanding of law and justice, the res publica, as the people's affair. His belief in a composite, mixed constitution to balance liberty and order, drawing on Rome's own history, and his conviction that virtuous, philosophically informed statesmen, guided by natural law, were absolutely essential.
And we've also seen the heartbreaking challenges he faced, the collision between these high ideals and the brutal political realities of his time, the endemic corruption, the intractable class conflict, the overwhelming power of military commanders, the widening gap between his city-state republican vision and the structural demands of governing a vast, complex empire.
His political project, his attempt to restore the Republic through a Concordia Ordinum led by a virtuous Senate, ultimately failed. It couldn't bridge that gap. The forces arrayed against him, and perhaps the forces of history itself, were too strong.
But his writings, thankfully preserved through the centuries, ensured that the powerful concepts he championed natural law as a universal standard for justice, the Commonwealth as belonging to all its members, the principles of mixed government, checks and balances, and republican liberty, these ideas were passed on.
They became foundational texts, shaping Western political thought and institutions for centuries, profoundly influencing debates about law, justice, and the best form of government, even if they couldn't save Cicero's own world in his lifetime.
And Cicero's story, his struggle, leaves us with a fundamental question, doesn't it? One that still feels incredibly relevant today. When faced with massive political, social, maybe even technological transformation, how much can ideals, even noble ones, forged in a different time and context, truly guide us? At what point must our political theories themselves undergo a radical transformation to genuinely address the new facts on the ground?
It's that enduring, difficult tension, isn't it, between holding on to cherished principles and traditions and the undeniable necessity of adapting our thinking, our institutions, maybe even our ideals themselves, to a dramatically changing reality. How do we navigate that?
A tension that defined not just Cicero's tragic era, but arguably continues to define our own as well. Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex world and enduring thought of Marcus Tullius Cicero.